NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement, and became effective in the Clinton administration in 1st January 1994 and established this agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. The main thing it did was reduce trade tariffs and eased the barriers, between the three countries and did away with quotas and also standardized finance and service exchanges. So what it did was make the whole transfer of goods between these three countries much, much easier. And it was seen as a way to build the economies of all three countries. But there were some repercussions there that nobody kind of really thought of, which we'll get to in a second. Now, what it did was promise a higher standard of living, especially for Mexicans. And it did create more jobs because U.S. companies started to invest in the Mexican market. And Mexican exporters then increased their sales to the United States and Canada. But you have to wonder, well, why did, it created more jobs here, but it cost jobs in the United States. And this kind of all incorporated what we call the maquiladoras, which are small assembly. They're not really factories, really. Oftentimes they can be just rooms, if you will, but they're sites in the twin cities, in the border cities, and sometimes a little further away, like Chihuahua, Monterrey, that perform these tasks. So parts would be imported into Mexico, where they would be put together. Your cars, computers, things like that, TVs, your remote control, especially. All the parts will be shipped here, where it's all put together and then re-imported into the U.S. Now, interestingly enough, they started as coupon houses, and that meant, and hopefully you can see this. Now, every Sunday you get all these coupons in the Sunday paper, for example. And let's say you go to the store and you use a couple of them. Well, then the store collects them because they want to get reimbursed by the manufacturer. But there's thousands, and and they're all piled together, hundreds of thousands. So they ship them down to Mexico, where the maquiladora hires people, usually women, to sort them out. And so that is the job. You just are sorting the coupons out by the manufacturer. Now, as it became more computer-oriented, that kind of is not used anymore. It still is, but not nearly as much. So they became what we call assembly plants. And there they would assemble imported duty-free components and then export the finished products. They were mostly foreign-owned. U.S., Canada, and Japan were main owners, and over 80% of the goods were re-exported to the U.S. So the only thing that is really changing here is that the tariff is associated with the value added during assembly. And it's cheaper if it's assembled in Mexico, so the tariff is lower than if you did it in the United States. Now, this is just Tijuana. All we're looking at is, let me go back a couple slides. So we're looking at Tijuana right here. Notice the size of the circle indicates the number of maquiladoras. And so here's the border right here. This is, I forget the name of the street, but this is kind of like the main drag that goes into the industrial area. And you can see all the maquiladoras around here. And, again, oftentimes they are like these, for example. They might all be owned by the same company, like maybe Ford or one of the major automobile manufacturers. So they're all assembling different components of your car, and then they'll all be collected and shipped back to the U.S. So there was about 4,000 of them countrywide that employed about over 1 million people, and was 45% of Mexico's total exports. As the world economy is all connected, and in some cases what's happened is well, rightfully so, the Mexican workers were complaining about their low wages, and the manufacturers just said, okay, we'll take it somewhere else. They've actually gone over to East Asia and Southeast Asia because the labor is even cheaper there. So this again, this is just looking at all those in Tijuana, and this is the country of origin. Who owns them? Uh, Notice that Spain is the largest here. Joint owned U.S., Mexico, China, Mexico, Korea, Japan, or the U.S., Japan, so forth and so on. Even Mexico owns a few. Why Spain? Well, because Spain, its main auto company is the SEAT company, S-E-A-T, and they manufacture Volkswagens. And that is a car that is, the whole car is often assembled in Mexico. And so there's a large part of that is done at the maquiladoras, the assembly of all the various components, your headlight assembly, for example, brake parts, stereo parts, things like that. So a lot of electronic equipment, appliances, auto parts, a lot of clothing, and lots of furniture too as well. So here's kind of, breaking it down. So 28% textile industries, 16% electronic industries. Those are your two largest. But then other stuff as well. Machinery, furniture is a large part. It's just funny. Just anything. In your home, just look and see where it's manufactured. Now it might say made in the U.S. All that means is the part itself was made in the U.S. That doesn't mean it was assembled. And a lot of them nowadays mention where they're assembled. So that's kind of fun to look at that. So they purchase, molded plastics, repair supplies, wire, steel, chemicals, which we'll get to in a second, wood products. And notice what's happened. This is the per capita income along the Mexico border. So if the national average is a dollar, notice how much higher it is in the states that border the United States. Over here, it would be $1.40. Even here, dollar up to $1.20. $1.20 right here, for example. So as people move up here, they're going to make more money, even working these relatively low-paying jobs. Now, there is a lot of labor strife. Again, notice that it's mostly women that work at these because culturally speaking, the owners of the companies, be that Asian or whatever, perceive the Mexican women as being more subservient, if you will, more docile. They're not going to talk back, not cause trouble. So that tends to be who they hire. The other thing is environmental damage. We mentioned chemicals. Well, again, not pretty lax environmental laws. So, here's a maquiladoras, and you just throw the chemicals, over the hill and into the stream. And again, creates, major economic damage or environmental damage. Here's just some of the companies that, BMW, Bayer is a big chemical company, Casio, Chrysler, cars, Eli Lilly chemicals, Ericsson, your phones, Fisher Price toys, cars from Ford, JVC, GM, all these. Not just a small part of it. Oh, here's the next group over here. Mitsubishi, Mercedes-Benz, Mattel, IBM. So all these companies own maquiladoras in Mexico. Now the advantage is, well, Mexico gets jobs, gets foreign investment, and the foreign owners can get the cheaper labor costs. So it does help regional development and increases international growth. But it's uneven development. As we've seen, it's only the northern states that profit. Worker conditions, not very good. Environmental conditions, pretty horrible, as we've seen. Okay, you know what? As we look at, as the women go into the workforce, they tend to have fewer children. They get, in a general sense, women today are getting more educated, and again, in Mexico, for example, and therefore making choices perhaps not to have as many children. So note here, in Mexico, in the last, 30 years, it's the women in the workforce have almost doubled. for example, and therefore the birth rate has gone down a little bit to 2.8. Now compare that to other countries where the birth rates are still a little, well, so there's a correlation generally between more women in the work, well, that's not entirely true, but in general, the more women in the workforce, that means they don't necessarily stay at home, so they tend to have fewer children, for example. Now, this is what I want you to look at. So this is the wage rates compared. So assemblers in the United States, if it's a union job, can make up to above $17 an hour if it's a union job. Mostly it's not, so it might only be around 10. If it's skilled labor, it's even higher. But notice what happens when you send it down to the maquiladora in Mexico. It drops from a high of 17 down to maybe $2. And so that's a lot of money saved for the company owning the maquiladora, and hence the business that goes down that way. And that's the advantage of NAFTA and the advantage of the maquiladora. So today, with that border region, Canada is still the United States' largest export market, but now Mexico has moved into second place. Because of NAFTA, 85% of all Mexican exports now go to the United States, but interestingly enough, 75% of all of Mexico's imports originate in the U.S. So basically what's happening is we're sending stuff down in the case of the assembly stuff, and it's going right back to the United States. Okay, so that's not necessarily in the book, but there's a bunch of questions on the test related to that. So make sure you, if you need to come back to the lecture and get the answers.